Hi, I'm Tori, and I am a doctor of physical therapy who specializes in pelvic dysfunction, and I think that pelvic health and pelvic issues should both be more openly discussed and widely understood because everyone has a pelvis. So today we are going to discuss why Kegels are sometimes good and sometimes bad. The pelvic floor is getting a lot more attention in the mainstream nowadays, which is phenomenal, and I'm glad for it. However, with more attention comes more potential for misinformation. And unfortunately, Kegels, or pelvic floor contractions, are being sold as the answer to any and all pelvic floor issues. While Kegels can be immensely helpful in treating some people's pelvic floor dysfunction sometimes, other times they can actually make a problem worse. Here's why. The pelvic floor is a group of muscles, and just like any other muscle, it's important that it has access to its full range of motion. Said another way, if we pretend that my bicep is my pelvic floor, it's important that the pelvic floor can contract, relax, bear down, and relax so that it can perform all of its functions. Sometimes pelvic floors can become too long or too weak, and that weakness can lead to pelvic dysfunction. However, other times pelvic floors can become too short, too tight, and that tightness can lead to pelvic dysfunction. In fact, that's one way to simplify pelvic issues to help guide interventions in the clinic. Is this happening because the pelvic floor is too long, or is this happening because the pelvic floor is too short? In cases where the pelvic floor truly is too long, of course, practicing Kegels can be helpful, not only to retrain range of motion, but also to retrain strength. However, in cases where the pelvic floor is too short, practicing Kegels can not only be unhelpful, but sometimes it can make a short floor shorter, which makes the problem worse. If you know that you have a longer pelvic floor and that weakness is at the core of your pelvic issue, Kegels are usually great. However, if you think that your pelvic floor might be too short and that tightness is at the core of your pelvic issue, or if you aren't sure, it might be worthwhile to schedule an appointment with a local pelvic physical therapist and find out. I do have a link for you to a provider directory in the description below. If you are unable to access a therapist and you aren't sure if Kegels are right for you, know that while there are always exceptions, there are patterns in people's past medical histories that can help predict where their pelvic issues might fall on that spectrum according to what they've experienced in their lives. For example, someone who has delivered a baby or is postmenopausal or is very sedentary is more likely to have a longer pelvic floor, whereas someone who has never delivered a baby or is very young or has undergone a form of pelvic trauma other than childbirth is more likely to have a shorter pelvic floor. If you're starting to realize that you might have pelvic floor tightness, pelvic floor relaxation, the opposite of Kegels, could be more helpful for you. I do have a pelvic floor relaxation routine here on the channel that you can check out here, and that is why Kegels are sometimes good and sometimes bad. Thank you so much for watching, and please do be sure to join me on the 10th and 20th of every month for future pelvic PSAs, with surprise PSAs on the 30th when I can create them, where I attempt to cover an interesting pelvic health or pelvic issue topic in 5 minutes or less. See you next time.